If you can, freeze, dehydrate, garden, buy in bulk, or keep food stored for your family, you probably care about making good food last. But sometimes the methods we already use run into limits. The freezer gets packed. The garden produces everything at once. Leftovers get forgotten. And if the power stays off long enough, everything in that freezer suddenly has a clock ticking. Freeze drying is another preservation method you may want on your radar. Most of us already use more than one way to preserve food. We can. We freeze. We dehydrate. We vacuum seal. We store dry goods. And those methods work. Freeze drying does not have to replace any of them. Think of it as one more tool in the food preservation toolbox. Sometimes a different tool is better suited to a particular food, situation, or later use. So what actually is freeze drying? In simple terms, the food is frozen. Most of the moisture is removed under a vacuum, and the finished food becomes dry, lightweight, and ready to package for storage. That is really the basic process. So why does removing the water matter? Water is one of the big reasons fresh food does not last indefinitely. Freeze drying removes most of that water while using very little heat. That low heat process helps preserve the things we care about in food, including flavor, color, shape, texture, and nutrients. And once most of that water is gone, something else happens. The food gets really light. A surprising amount of the weight in many foods is simply water. After freeze drying, some foods can weigh roughly 85 to 95% less than they did before most of that water was removed. To put that into perspective, a pound of strawberries is 16 ounces. After freeze drying, that same pound could come out weighing around an ounce or so, depending on the strawberries and how much moisture they contained. That is a dramatic difference. That can make stored food easier to move, carry, and fit into your food storage system. So you are not just changing how long food may keep, you are also changing the physical form and weight of that food. And this is usually the number that gets people's attention. Properly freeze-dried and stored foods can have a potential shelf life of up to 25 years. Compare that with the figures commonly cited here. Dehydrated foods, up to 4 years. Canned foods, up to 3 years. Frozen foods, up to 2 years. But notice the words up to. Not every food lasts the same amount of time. Shelf life is not one magic number. The food itself matters. Fat content matters. Moisture matters. Sugar can matter. Packaging matters. Oxygen exposure matters. And temperature and storage conditions matter. So when you hear up to 25 years, that does not mean every freeze-dried food automatically lasts 25 years. The preservation method matters, but so do the food itself, preparation, packaging, and storage. Shelf life is not the only comparison either. Preservation methods can also affect nutrient retention differently. Freeze-drying is known for retaining a high percentage of nutrients, up to 97%, according to the claims we are using here. The comparison shown here lists dehydration at up to 60% and canning at up to 40%. Why the difference? One important reason is heat. Freeze-drying uses very little heat compared with many other preservation methods. And again, actual nutrient retention varies by the food, the nutrient, and the processing method. These methods also produce very different finished foods. Canned foods are generally stored in liquid, and jars are heavier. Dehydrated foods become smaller and are often chewy or dense. Freeze-dried foods become dry, very lightweight, and often crisp, and many can later be rehydrated. None of those outcomes is automatically better. They are simply different methods, different strengths. Now what about freezing? Freezing is familiar, effective, and honestly, one of the easiest preservation methods we have. But freezing has one major requirement: continuous power. It also requires freezer space. If your freezer is full, you are out of room. And if the power is out long enough, the food inside can become a loss. Freeze-dried food, once properly packaged, does not need to stay plugged in. And this may sound familiar. You buy meat on sale, the garden is producing, you cooked extra meals, you found a great deal at the store, and suddenly, opening the freezer becomes a game of food storage Jenga. Freezing is useful until you simply run out of space. Freeze-drying can give you another route for some of those foods and take some of the pressure off your freezer. Gardeners know another version of this problem very well. Nothing happens for a while, and then apparently every tomato, zucchini, pepper, berry, onion, herb, and green in the garden gets the same memo. Today is the day. Canning and dehydrating are wonderful options. Freeze-drying gives you another way to preserve that harvest when everything shows up at once. And here is another place I think freeze-drying gets really interesting. Not everything you preserve has to start as a raw ingredient. A big pot of chili, chicken soup, a casserole, rice and vegetables, a complete meal you intentionally made too much of. Instead of watching leftovers migrate to the back of the refrigerator until nobody trusts them anymore, some meals can be freeze-dried and stored for later. That turns leftovers into future convenience instead of food waste. This is where people often have an aha moment. Freeze-drying is not only about strawberries and peas. It can also be about meals. Chili, casseroles, soups, pasta dishes, breakfast foods, leftovers. In other words, food your family already recognizes and already eats. That can make stored food a lot more practical. Many freeze-dried foods can also be rehydrated. Take something like chicken noodle soup. You start with the cooked soup. Freeze-drying removes most of the moisture. Later, you add water back. The texture may not always return exactly to the original, but the flavor can remain very recognizable. That is one reason freeze-drying can work so well for meals and ingredients you plan to use later. Now, there is a good chance your first exposure to freeze-drying was not soup. It was candy. Freeze-dried candy became popular because it is colorful, crunchy, fun, visually interesting, and yes, some people have turned it into a small business or side income opportunity. There is nothing wrong with that. If candy is the only thing you associate with freeze-drying, you are missing most of the story. Freeze-drying can involve an enormous variety of foods: fruits, vegetables, eggs, dairy, meats, soups, complete meals, leftovers, herbs, desserts. Instead of only asking, what do people freeze dry? A better question may be, what foods are already moving through my kitchen that I wish I could keep longer? Now for the part people sometimes skip. Freeze-drying has limitations. Very high-fat foods are generally poor candidates for long-term freeze-drying. Straight oils and butter are not ideal. Nut butters can be problematic. Certain concentrated sugars, such as honey and syrups, do not behave like ordinary foods. And chocolate itself is generally not a good freeze-drying candidate. So no, you cannot toss absolutely anything into a freeze dryer and expect magic. Understanding the limitations is part of being a smarter food preserver. Getting the food dry is also only half the job. Once freeze-dried food is exposed again to moisture and oxygen, those become enemies of long-term storage. That is why packaging matters. People commonly use properly sealed Mylar bags or jars, oxygen absorbers where appropriate, and storage conditions that are cool, dry, and dark. You do not need a packaging degree to understand the basic rule. Great food still needs great protection. So now bring all of this back to your own life. Maybe the garden gives you too much at once. Maybe you cook large batches. Maybe food goes on sale and you want to stock up. Maybe your freezer is already full. Maybe you want familiar foods available for emergencies. The question is not, which preservation method is best? That question is too broad. The better question is, which preservation method makes the most sense for this food and the way I want to use it later? And this is important. Freeze-drying is not magic. It does not mean every food works equally well. It does not mean every food lasts 25 years. It does not mean you throw away your canner or dehydrator. It does not mean owning a freeze dryer takes no work. And it certainly does not mean everybody needs one. Freeze-drying simply gives food preservers another tool. That is all it needs to be. So why learn about freeze-drying at all? Because even if you never buy a machine, understanding the method gives you another option to evaluate. It may help you preserve more of the foods you already eat, reduce food waste, store certain foods for much longer periods, add more variety to long-term storage, control the ingredients in the foods you preserve foods without relying on added preservatives, and make some stored foods dramatically lighter. You do not have to want a freeze dryer to benefit from understanding freeze drying. If this made you think, Okay, I finally understand why people are interested in this. I created a beginner guide specifically for you. It is called What is Freeze Drying All About? Comment Pantry below, and I will send it to you. There is no purchase required, no machine pitch, no strings attached, just useful beginner information so you can keep learning and decide for yourself whether freeze drying is worth exploring.